In the 15th century Balkans, Ottoman invincibility was not an abstract idea. It was a working policy. It moved with armies, but it also moved with paperwork. Hostages taken as guarantees, oaths extracted from local lords, and forts turned into administrative locks on mountain routes. The empire didn't just want Albania as territory. It wanted Albania as a corridor, pressure on the Adriatic, leverage over Venice, and a forward edge that made the next conquest feel inevitable. Here is the moral question that will govern this story. When an empire rules by inevitability, by making resistance look irrational, what actually breaks that spell? A heroic battle? Or the slow process of forcing the empire to pay real costs in time, supplies, and credibility until the myth collapses under its own receipts? Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Skanderbeg, Gjergj Kastrioti, begins inside that system, not outside it. His father, Gjorn Kastrioti, was one of several Albanian lords navigating Ottoman pressure through shifting submission and revolt. One method the empire used to secure obedience was political hostage-taking, sons kept under Ottoman control as insurance. Gjergj was brought into Ottoman orbit, converted to Islam, trained and advanced as a military commander. The point of this system was simple: turn border elites into imperial instruments, not by destroying them, by incorporating them. That is why Skanderbeg's later rebellion mattered beyond Albania. It was not a random uprising from the margins. It was a defection from inside the machinery. The rupture comes in 1443, after the Ottoman setback near Niš. In the confusion of withdrawal, Skanderbeg breaks away and heads back toward his homeland. What follows is one of the most repeated and most disputed details in his story: the seizure of Krujë. Many later accounts describe deception or forged orders to secure the fortress quickly. You don't have to pin the entire event to a single dramatic trick to keep it historically grounded. What is firm is the result. Krujë becomes his base, and the rebellion becomes visible, not theoretical. A fortress that mattered strategically was no longer performing obedience. But a fortress is not a state. Albania at this time was a patchwork of rival noble families, local armies, and grudges that predated the Ottomans. Skanderbeg's immediate problem was not only the empire that would retaliate, it was the political reality that unity had to be manufactured, negotiated, because no single lord automatically owned Albania as a nation. So the story does not begin with a fair fight. It begins with a system failing to hold what it thought it had permanently converted: a trained commander, shaped by Ottoman methods, turning those methods back toward the borderlands. The empire could survive losing men. Empires always do. What they cannot tolerate is losing the logic of inevitability, the belief that their rule is the only rational future. And that leads to the next step. If Krujë is the lock, how does one man persuade rival lords to become a single key? The Ottoman Empire did not expand by improvisation. It expanded by repetition, by turning conquest into a routine that could be taught, funded, and administered. That is what made it terrifying to its neighbors. A raid could be luck. An empire is a process. On the Albanian frontier, that process had several layers. There was the obvious layer: military pressure, punitive expeditions, the threat of siege. But beneath that was the quieter layer that made resistance so hard to sustain. Guarantees. The empire wanted local lords to obey, not only because they feared punishment, but because their own families were woven into Ottoman leverage. A border lord could gamble with his own life. He could not gamble as easily with his son. This is where Skanderbeg begins, not as a romantic outsider, but as a political hostage inside an imperial design. We need to be precise here, because popular retellings blur different Ottoman practices into one horror montage. The empire did use multiple recruitment and control mechanisms across the Balkans. One was the broad extraction of human labor and military service. Another distinct practice was devshirme, the levy that recruited Christian boys for state service and, over time, for the Janissary Corps and palace administration. But Skanderbeg's story, in its most historically defensible form, is first and foremost a case of hostage-taking from an elite household, a tool aimed at securing a specific lord's compliance, not a random sweep of peasant doors. The point remains brutal, but the mechanism matters. This was targeted political control, not only mass recruitment. Inside the Ottoman system, the hostage does not merely suffer, he is shaped. Gjergj Kastrioti is removed from the local world that would have taught him to be a regional warlord, and he is placed into an empire that teaches him to be something else, an officer whose loyalty is supposed to run upward, not outward. Conversion to Islam is part of that reshaping, not always because of sincere belief, but because religion in an empire is also an administrative category. It marks you as inside the ruler's moral universe. It makes your advancement legible. It makes your future dependent on imperial favor. Then comes training, discipline, cavalry tactics, command structure, the practical logic of campaigning, where supplies come from, how long a march takes, what happens when a column loses forage, how the army punishes local populations, how it rewards submission. This is the anatomy of Ottoman power that a border lord back home could only guess at. Skanderbeg learns it as routine, and this is where the moral psychology sharpens. Empires do not simply dominate their enemies, they try to convert them into employees. They offer salaries, titles, prestige, and the small but intoxicating feeling of being protected by the strongest machine on earth. In return, you become a living proof that the machine can assimilate anyone. The hostage becomes propaganda. Look, even your sons prefer us. That assimilation has a hidden cost. It produces a person who can never fully go home, and never fully belong inside the empire either. If he succeeds, he is praised, but always watched. If he hesitates, he is reminded of what the empire still holds. Power does not need to torture you every day if it can simply maintain the conditions that make you torture yourself. Calculating, adapting, performing loyalty. This is why Skanderbeg's eventual defection is not a simple betrayal. It is a structural failure. It means the empire's claim that identity can be rewritten permanently by control and reward has limits. It means that the hostage policy can backfire, producing not a pacified border elite, but a commander who understands the empire's strengths and weaknesses better than the people the empire is trying to rule. Because if you know how the empire feeds its armies, you know where it starves. If you know how it moves orders, you know how quickly it can react, and how slowly. If you know what terrifies its soldiers, you know what to make them hear at night. There is another reason this matters. It exposes the difference between conquest and governance. Conquest is the moment a city falls. Governance is the long period in which you must keep the city from rising again. For governance, the Ottomans needed collaborators and converted elites. Hostages were a way to manufacture both. Skanderbeg's life, up to 1443, looks like a success story from Istanbul's perspective. A noble-born captive molded into a capable commander, integrated into imperial service. This is exactly what the system was designed to produce. Which brings us back to the big question, now sharpened by mechanism rather than myth. If empire is a machine that converts people into tools, what happens when one tool snaps and becomes a weapon pointed backward? Because in 1443, after Nish, Skanderbeg does not merely flee. He carries the empire's habits with him. He carries its operational understanding. He carries, in effect, a copy of the blueprint. And that is why the next move, seizing Krujë and forcing Albanian rivals into a common front, will not be a heroic charge. It will be an argument, a negotiation under threat, a test of whether unity can be engineered as deliberately as the empire engineered obedience. So here is the open loop as we step into 1444. How do you build a coalition out of men who do not trust each other, when the empire you're resisting has spent decades teaching them that trust is naive and submission is profitable? Nish matters because it is one of those moments empires hate, a battlefield outcome that turns into an administrative crisis. Armies can lose. The danger is what loss does to the chain of command, when retreat breaks the illusion that orders are permanent and fear is one-directional. In 1443, during the Ottoman setback near Niš against forces led by John Hunyadi, the Ottoman war machine stumbles. Columns pull back. Priorities shift from victory to survival. And in that transitional fog, when a superpower is briefly forced to improvise, Skanderbeg leaves. This is the point where popular retellings start demanding a single cinematic mechanism. The forged order, the stolen seal, the dramatic assassination of a scribe. Historically, you should treat that as later narrative detail rather than courtroom proof. But you do not need the most theatrical version to understand the real historical logic. The solid core is this. Skanderbeg defects in 1443, returns toward his inherited sphere, and quickly takes control of a key fortress, Krujë, then makes his break public by turning that place into a center of resistance. Whether he obtained entry by deception, intimidation, negotiation, or a mix of all three, the act itself is what matters politically. A fortress on a mountain ridge is not just a wall, it is a statement. The empire's authority is not automatic here. Krujë sits where geography becomes policy. It overlooks routes that connect the interior mountain world to the plains and the coastal approaches. Control the fortress and you can disrupt movement, troops, messengers, taxes, and the quiet conversion of villages into obedient administrative units. Lose it, and you have a jagged stone in your shoe, a small thing that makes every march more expensive. This is where the story stops being about a single man and becomes about logistics. Because after 1443, Skanderbeg's first problem is not how to defeat the Ottomans in a fair fight. A fair fight is a fantasy. The empire can field larger forces, sustain longer campaigns, and replace losses with a depth of manpower and revenue that a fractured frontier cannot match. The first problem is, how to make the empire's size work against it, how to force mass to become slow, how to make numbers require supplies that can be cut, how to make a giant bleed from small wounds. But he cannot even attempt that strategy without a second miracle, one that is harder than winning a battle: political unity. In the 15th century, there is no single Albanian state with centralized authority. There are noble families, regional lords, competing claims, and centuries of local rivalry. Some have negotiated with the Ottomans before, some resent each other more than they fear Istanbul. The empire understands this and exploits it. Divide the border, pick off the fortresses, reward submission, punish defiance, and keep every lord wondering whether his neighbor will sell him out first. Skanderbeg is not automatically trusted in this landscape. He returns wearing the shape of Ottoman service, trained in their ways, marked by their court, associated with the very system many lords have been forced to bargain with. Even if they respect his ability, they can still fear his ambition. A man who knows the empire that well can either be a shield or a future tyrant. And in Balkan politics, that is not paranoia, it is experience. So the uniform splitting is not only personal, it is social. He has to persuade men to risk their autonomy under his command. And he cannot do it with morality alone. Morality does not feed an army, it does not pay cavalry, it does not repair walls. What he has, initially, is a fortress and a reputation, and both are forms of currency. Krujë becomes a bank, not of money, but of credibility. If he can hold it, lords might believe resistance is not suicide. If he loses it quickly, they will treat his rebellion as a temporary disturbance and rush to make their peace with the empire. This is why the early phase is so tense. Every decision has two audiences: the Ottomans, who must be convinced that the cost will be high, and the Albanian lords, who must be convinced that unity will not be fatal to their status. Notice what this reveals about power. Empires do not only punish rebellion, they wait for rebellion to prove itself impossible. They rely on the psychology of failure. If the first act collapses, the second act never needs to be written. The empire saves money, time, and soldiers because the border convinces itself to surrender in advance. Skanderbeg's move in 1443 to 1444 disrupts that economy. He forces the question into the open. If you do nothing, you will be absorbed, slowly, legally, administratively, until there is nothing left to rebel with. If you do something, you risk annihilation. By the way, there is a price. The only debate is who pays it and who benefits. And that takes us to the next necessary event. March 1444, Lezhë, neutral Venetian ground, where the war stops being only raids and fortresses and becomes a political engineering project. Because if Krujë is the lock, Lezhë must produce the key, an alliance strong enough to make the empire spend real resources to keep its myth alive. So here is the open loop that carries us forward. How do you convince rival lords to sign a shared future when they can't even agree on a shared past? If Krujë was the military statement, Lezhë was the political one. In March 1444, Albanian lords gathered in Lezhë, a town under Venetian control at the time. That detail matters more than people think. Venetian ground is not neutral because everyone trusts Venice. It is neutral because it is outside the immediate jurisdiction of any single Albanian family. It reduces the risk that a meeting becomes a trap. In a region where diplomacy often ends with a dagger, location is a form of security policy. The League of Lezhë is often described as the first moment Albania fights as one. That's a useful shorthand, but it hides the real mechanics. This was not a modern nation-state being born. It was a coalition, a bargain among rivals who kept their own lands and their own interests, agreeing to contribute men and money for a shared war. And they did it because the alternative was worse, becoming isolated fortresses waiting to be processed one by one. This is where Skanderbeg's power becomes more interesting than battlefield tactics. He does not arrive as a crowned monarch. He arrives as a commander with a fortress, a reputation, and a problem. He cannot win alone. So the League is not simply unity. It is managed distrust, a temporary alignment of self-interest under existential pressure. And that pressure is not vague. It has a supply chain. Ottoman response to rebellion does not start with poetry. It starts with logistics, assembling troops, moving grain, organizing siege equipment, deciding which routes to march, which valleys can be stripped of forage, which local leaders can be bribed, and which must be crushed publicly. The empire's violence is systematic because it is funded, and because it has learned to make terror efficient. Skanderbeg's argument, whether delivered in the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, as later tradition emphasizes, or in a council room thick with armed escorts, would have to be concrete, not freedom in the abstract. Survival in the measurable sense. If you fight each other, you will be conquered separately. If you fight together, you might force the empire to pay enough to hesitate. This is why the League's structure matters. It is not total submission to Skanderbeg. He is chosen as commander-in-chief, but the lords retain autonomy. That is a concession to reality. They are not ready to dissolve their power into a single crown, and if he demanded it, the League might never form. A coalition that exists is stronger than a perfect state that never arrives. So, unity becomes a weapon, because it changes the empire's math. A divided Albania is a series of small problems. A united Albania is one problem that cannot be solved quickly. And cannot be solved quickly is the first crack in imperial myth. Empires survive setbacks. What they fear is delay. Delay creates costs. Costs create doubt. Doubt spreads like a disease through bureaucracies and armies that are trained to believe the world is already decided. But the League is also a liability, because it is built on fear more than trust. The lords agree to contribute, but how much and when? Who gets credit for victories? Who takes losses? Who controls key passes and taxes? A coalition like this is always one bad season away from fracture. The empire understands that too. Ottoman's strategy is not only to defeat armies, it is to defeat alliances. It can do that with gold, with titles, with selective punishment, and with the simplest poison of all, making each lord suspect that the others are negotiating in secret. This is where Skanderbeg must do something psychologically difficult. He has to make the war feel like shared ownership, not his personal ambition. If he looks like a king in waiting, the League becomes a hostage of internal politics. If he looks like a captain chosen by necessity, the League has a chance. Later tradition attributes to him a line along the logic of, "I did not bring you liberty, I found it among you." Whether he said those exact words is less important than the rhetorical move behind them. The move is smart. It flatters the Lord's pride while demanding their cooperation. It tells them they are not surrendering to him. They are recognizing themselves in a mirror. Pride can be weaponized just as efficiently as fear. Now look at what the League is really producing. Not only an army, but a decision-making system, however fragile, capable of coordinating defense. It means signal fires, messengers, contributions of manpower, and agreed priorities, which fortresses to hold, which valleys to empty, which routes to deny. It is the beginning of a counter-logistics. Because guerrilla warfare is not merely hit and run, it is coordinated denial of resources, coordinated control of time. And this returns us to the big question in a sharper form. If the Ottoman Empire rules by inevitability, then the League's true function is not to win every battle. It is to make inevitability look expensive, to make conquest require years rather than weeks, to force the empire to spend attention, grain, and prestige on a rocky borderland that should have folded quietly. But a weapon has recoil. Unity created by fear must be maintained by success. If Skanderbeg cannot deliver early proof, real victories, real survival, then every lord has a rational reason to abandon the coalition and bargain separately. So here is the open loop that drives us into the next event. What happens when a fragile alliance needs a victory fast, and the Empire sends a professional army to crush it before it becomes real? A new alliance is a rumor until it survives contact with a professional army. The League of Lezhë could sign vows all day. The Ottoman Empire would judge it worth it. The only way empires judge frontier noise, by sending a commander with orders to end it fast. This is the part most retellings get wrong in tone. They treat early Skanderbeg as a heroic underdog who wins because of courage. Courage is cheap. The Ottomans had courage in bulk. What Skanderbeg needed in 1444 was something colder, a way to make Ottoman superiority malfunction. The confrontation, usually labelled the Battle of Torviol, sometimes placed in late June 1444 in many narratives, becomes that test. The exact numbers are debated because medieval reporting loves inflation. Victory is always bigger when you want patrons, and defeat is always smaller when you want your head to stay on your shoulders. So treat the figures like smoke, not stone. The Ottomans likely fielded a larger force. The League likely fielded a smaller one. That imbalance is the only point that matters for understanding the system. Because the real battlefield is not the valley floor. It's the assumption the Ottoman army carries into the valley. Ottoman commanders were used to a pattern. A rebellious lord retreats into a fortress. The empire brings siege pressure. The countryside gets punished until the fortress negotiates, and the rebellion is converted into paperwork again. That pattern depends on one psychological constant. The rebels behave predictably. They hide. They wait. They hope for outside help. Skanderbeg breaks that expectation early. He does not treat the first Ottoman thrust as something to endure. He treats it as a chance to reprogram the empire's perception. Make them believe this frontier is not safe, not legible, and not cheap. So, Torviol is less a duel of armies than a demonstration of method. Geography is his first weapon. Albania is not a plain where a larger force can unfold like a curtain. It's a landscape of constrictions, passes, slopes, wooded ridges, sudden choke points where marching order becomes vulnerability. A big army brings more blades, yes. It also brings more mouths, more horses, more wagons, more time spent compressing into a space that can't hold it. That is the logistical truth empires try to hide. Size is a debt you must service daily. Grain has to arrive. Forage has to be found. Water has to be secured. And when an army stretches out into a column through broken terrain, its command structure weakens. Messages slow down. Units stop seeing each other. Panic travels faster than orders. Skanderbeg's second weapon is timing. If you want to beat a larger army, you don't chase its strength. You strike its transitions. Moments when it is moving, searching, foraging, reorganizing. Moments when discipline is stretched thin. This is where guerrilla becomes an adult concept, not a romantic one. It is not merely hiding. It is controlling when the enemy is allowed to be coherent. And then there's the third weapon, misdirection. Present a force that looks manageable. Lure the enemy into committing forward, and make them believe the victory is already decided. Armies don't just move on terrain, they move on confidence. When soldiers think the enemy is collapsing, they surge. They break formation, they chase, they become greedy. They stop acting like a machine and start acting like individuals. That is when the trap shuts. Torviol is remembered as an ambush. Forces concealed on the flanks, a sudden strike from higher ground or from cover, a collapse of Ottoman order as they are hit from multiple directions. The specific choreography varies by telling, but the principle is consistent. Don't outfight, out-coordinate. Turn the enemy's forward motion into a disadvantage, then hit the parts of the army that keep it together. Command nodes, flanks, morale anchors. And when an army breaks in a confined space, the killing is not primarily about sword skill. It's about physics. Men can't maneuver. Horses panic. Units stampede into each other. Losses come from bottlenecks and fear as much as from blades. Now step back and look at the real product of this victory. It isn't bodies on the ground. It's a change in the market value of belief. For the League, Torviol is proof of life. It tells doubtful lords. Joining this coalition was not automatic suicide. It gives Skanderbeg the one resource he cannot buy: credibility. Because every future recruitment, every request for money, every demand that a village evacuate or burn its own stores, those sacrifices require faith that the sacrifices might work. For the Ottoman Empire, the loss is not only tactical, it's reputational. Empires survive defeats, but they hate defeats that look like humiliation, defeats that suggest a border commander can be made to look foolish by terrain and timing. Those are contagious. They spread through rumors to other frontier regions. They invite other lords to try the same trick. And for Western Europe, Torviol becomes something else entirely, a story that purchases comfort. Courts and popes love a frontier hero because a frontier hero lets them feel protected without paying the full bill of protection. Praise is cheaper than troops. A title is cheaper than grain shipments. Calling Skanderbeg the shield of Christendom is emotionally satisfying precisely because it postpones the uncomfortable question: who is actually fighting and who is merely watching? This is where the confrontation turns darker. A victory can feed a myth, and myths have their own supply chains. Skanderbeg's wins begin to generate European applause, letters, promises, ceremonial gifts. But applause does not keep walls standing. It does not replace horses. It does not heal the political fractures inside the League. And the Ottoman Empire is now forced to respond at a higher level because the rebellion has demonstrated it can strike outside the expected script, which means the next Ottoman move will not be a casual punitive expedition. It will be a decision about escalation, about whether this small war is allowed to remain small. So here's the open loop as we leave Torviol behind. When a superpower is embarrassed on the frontier, does it pay the cost to crush the symbol immediately? Or does it shift tactics, buy betrayals, and make the coalition collapse from the inside before the next siege even begins? After Torviol, the war stops being a local disturbance and becomes an imperial problem with a budget line. Empires can tolerate defiance as long as it stays cheap. A rebellious valley is one thing. A rebellious fortress that keeps surviving, year after year, turns into a contradiction. It forces the empire to answer an uncomfortable question. If we are inevitable, why are we still here, spending men and grain on this one cliff? That is why the siege of Krujë in 1450 matters. It's not just a famous siege. It's a demonstration of what happens when a superpower tries to reassert myth through logistics. Sultan Murad II comes personally. That is the first signal. When the ruler himself takes the field, the campaign is no longer about territory alone. It's about authority. It's about making sure everyone watching, Albanian lords, Venetian merchants, Balkan vassals, European courts, understands that defiance has an endpoint, and the endpoint is crushed stone. A siege is a form of arithmetic. Walls don't fall because an attacker is angry. They fall because an attacker can keep supplying pressure longer than the defenders can keep supplying endurance. You need food for men, fodder for horses, timber for engines, metal for artillery, labor for trenches and platforms, and discipline to keep thousands of bodies functioning in a space where disease is always waiting. If you can sustain that machine, you can turn a fortress into an appointment with starvation. Murad arrives with scale, a moving city of tents and kitchens and workshops, siege engines and bombardment, assault waves timed to grind defenders down. It is the empire doing what it does best, applying force as a repeatable procedure. But Krujë is not a fortress on a flat plain. It is a fortress fused to rock, sitting above narrow approaches. That geography turns Ottoman advantages into bottlenecks. A large army can't always unfold its numbers into a clean, decisive assault. The approach channels attackers into tight spaces where defenders can concentrate fire. Even when artillery is present, stone and elevation change the rate of damage. The fortress becomes not only a wall, but a problem of access. Inside the castle, the defenders are reduced to survival policy. Rations are measured, repairs become rituals. Morale is managed like a scarce resource. In a siege, bravery is less important than discipline. You can't spend arrows like emotion. You can't waste food because you feel heroic. You can't abandon posts because the noise breaks your nerves. The siege is psychological because it is constant. The sound of bombardment is not simply loud. It is a schedule that tries to teach defenders that the empire will never get tired. Murad tries the full toolbox, including negotiation and bribery. This is not unusual. It's part of siege logic. If you can buy a gate, you save lives and time. And time is not just time. Time is campaign season. Time is the difference between returning home before winter or rotting in the mud. Even for an empire, time costs. But the siege of Krujë is defined by what happens outside the walls. Skanderbeg does not treat the siege as a duel between artillery and stone. He treats it as a duel between supply systems. He leaves a garrison inside and keeps a mobile force outside in the mountains and forests. That decision reveals the core of his strategy. If you can't beat the empire head-on, you can still make its superiority expensive by attacking the one thing every large army depends on: sleep, forage, and secure movement. Night raids are not romantic. They are anti-logistics. A raid that kills a few sentries matters less than the secondary effects. Soldiers stop sleeping. Officers tighten discipline. Scouting parties become fearful. Foraging becomes an ambush risk. Supply columns require heavier escorts, which slows them and drains manpower from assaults. The besiegers begin to feel besieged by uncertainty. This is what breaks large armies first, more often than swords: the sense that the environment is hostile and unreadable. Disease thrives in camps where stress and malnutrition weaken bodies. Men who can't sleep make mistakes. Horses that can't graze weaken. And once an army starts losing strength to sickness and hunger, the myth of control begins to fracture from inside. Murad's siege becomes a contest between two clocks. The Ottoman clock is seasonal. Take the fortress before winter, before supply lines strain, before disease spreads. The Albanian clock is endurance. Make the siege last long enough that the empire's own calendar becomes its enemy. In that kind of war, a win can look like simply not losing, because every extra week the empire bleeds in the mountains is a week it cannot spend elsewhere. By autumn 1450, Murad withdraws. Whether you describe it as defeat, frustration, or pragmatic retreat, the political effect is the same. Krujë survives. And survival is a statement louder than any victory speech. It says the empire's will is not absolute. It says a fortress on a cliff can force the Sultan himself to leave without achieving his objective. Europe hears this and celebrates because it wants to believe someone else is holding the line. But celebration is not a supply train. And here is the darker consequence. Murad's failure does not end the war. It changes it. The empire learns that crushing Krujë quickly is not guaranteed. So it begins to look for other methods: permanent pressure, new bases, and the oldest imperial technique of all, turning allies into knives. So, the open loop, as we step out of 1450, is simple and dangerous. If the empire can't break the fortress, can it break the coalition? By buying betrayal, starving support, and making Skanderbeg's unity project collapse under the weight of its own scarcity. After Krujë survives 1450, Skanderbeg becomes something Europe loves. A story that lets distant capitals feel safe. This is not a compliment. It is a diagnosis. Western courts and popes praised him because his resistance made a terrifying reality easier to digest. If a small mountain coalition could hold back Murad II, then perhaps the Ottoman threat was manageable. Perhaps Italy was not next. Perhaps the frontier could remain over there, bleeding quietly, while the centers of power continued their own wars, marriages, trade deals, and internal feuds. But if you want to understand power, you have to stop listening to praise and start tracking payments. Because wars are not sustained by admiration. They are sustained by grain, metal, horses, wages, and the ability to keep a coalition from collapsing under hunger. Skanderbeg's core problem after 1450 is not tactical. It is economic and diplomatic. How do you fund a long war when your enemy is one of the most resource-rich states in the region? And your allies benefit from your resistance more than they invest in it. Here's what support often looks like in this period. Small subsidies, ceremonial gifts, promises of future crusades, titles that cost nothing to grant, and occasional shipments that arrive too late to change the season. Naples, Venice, and the papacy each had reasons to work with Skanderbeg, and each had reasons to hold back. Naples wanted a barrier across the Adriatic, but did not want to provoke a full Ottoman focus on Italy. Venice wanted trade stability and coastal control, and routinely balanced against whichever side threatened its profit most in a given year. The papacy wanted a champion for the idea of Christendom, but the papacy's greatest weakness was the same as Europe's. It could call for unity, but it could not force kings to pay for it. So Albania becomes what strategists would later call a buffer. But buffers are never neutral. A buffer is a place where other people's fear gets outsourced. When Europe calls Skanderbeg the shield, it is also admitting something it doesn't want to say. The shield is expected to take the hits. The moral weight of that is brutal when you remember what the hits are. They are not abstract. They are burned villages, emptied valleys, lost harvests, families fleeing into mountains, and a society forced to live with permanent mobilization. That's the hidden mathematics behind the hero's story. Every time the Ottomans marched, Skanderbeg's coalition had to make choices that look like cruelty from the outside. Evacuate civilians, destroy stores that might feed the enemy, strip the countryside so that a larger army cannot forage. Scorched earth is often narrated as a bold tactic, but on the ground it is a decision that starves your own people to deny food to an invader. It turns survival into self-harm managed for strategic effect, and that creates internal political pressure. The League of Lezhë was never a nation-state. It was an alliance of lords who agreed to cooperate, because the alternative was death by isolation. But lords measure loyalty against their own survival. When war drags on, the question inside the coalition becomes poisonous. Is this still worth it? And worth it for whom? This is where the empire's most effective weapons appear. Not cannons, but incentives. The Ottomans could offer defectors what Skanderbeg often couldn't. Stable income, titles recognized by a larger system, and a future that didn't require permanent scarcity. You don't have to romanticize betrayal to understand it. In a prolonged frontier war, betrayal often looks like a rational exit strategy. That is what makes it so dangerous. And Skanderbeg has to fight that, not with sermons, but with governance, distributing whatever resources he has, keeping men paid enough to stay, punishing disloyalty without triggering fear-driven collapse, and using victories as political glue. He has to convert military success into coalition stability. This is also where his reputation becomes double-edged. The more famous he becomes in Europe, the more he is treated as a symbol rather than a state actor with urgent material needs. Europe's letters and applause can actually weaken his bargaining power. because admiration tempts patrons into thinking inspiration is a substitute for assistance. "He's winning already, isn't he?" is a deadly assumption. Meanwhile, the Ottoman court is watching something else. Not just battles, but the cost of maintaining pressure against this symbol. If Skanderbeg remains alive and effective, he keeps broadcasting a dangerous signal across the Balkans. The empire can be resisted. That signal is worth crushing. But crushing it by siege has proven expensive. So, the empire's strategy shifts toward what empires do when walls don't fall fast enough: build alternatives to brute force. That means long-term bases. It means political manipulation. It means buying rivalries and turning family lines into fracture points. It means finding the weak joints in a coalition and applying money where cannons failed. And here's the philosophical turn. In this phase, the war is no longer only about defending Albania. It becomes a referendum on two systems of power. One system, Ottoman imperial governance, runs on scale, administration, and managed terror. The other, Skanderbeg's coalition, runs on fragile unity, improvisation, and the ability to make sacrifice feel meaningful. One system buys obedience, the other must continuously earn it. So the open loop at the end of Part 7 is not, will the Ottomans return? Of course they will. The real question is, can the empire defeat Skanderbeg without defeating him, by corrupting the human relationships that keep his coalition alive? Because if loyalty is the true wall, the smartest siege is the one that never touches stone. Empires learn. And one of the first lessons an empire learns on a stubborn frontier is this: if you cannot break the wall, break the people holding it together. After years of resistance, the Ottoman problem is no longer simply Krujë is hard to take. It is that Skanderbeg has made defiance look survivable. That is the infection. The empire can kill soldiers, it can burn villages. But as long as the idea persists that a small coalition can delay, embarrass, and sometimes defeat imperial forces, other borderlands will start imagining their own exits. A superpower cannot afford that kind of imagination. So the war begins to tilt toward an older, quieter battlefield: loyalty. This is where you stop thinking like a modern viewer and start thinking like a 15th century commander, managing an alliance of proud lords and exhausted fighters. Skanderbeg's coalition is not a bureaucratic state with steady taxation and guaranteed salaries. It is a coalition stitched together by shared fear, intermittent foreign money, and the credibility of one man. In that setting, betrayal is not only a moral failure, it is a strategic event, because one important defection can cause 10 smaller defections through panic alone. Ottoman policy understood this. Gold is often cheaper than a campaign. A title is cheaper than a siege. A promise is cheaper than a winter spent watching your horses die of hunger in the mountains. Enter Moisi Golemi, a senior commander in Skanderbeg's circle, remembered in many accounts as a valuable captain who at one point defects to the Ottomans and later returns. The exact details differ across sources, but the structural meaning is consistent and historically plausible. The Ottomans sought to neutralize Skanderbeg by recruiting the people closest to him, the people who knew his methods, his habits, his routes, his timing. This is how an empire tries to turn your strengths into liabilities. If Skanderbeg's advantage is intimate knowledge of Ottoman methods, the Ottoman counter is to gain intimate knowledge of Skanderbegs. And psychologically, it's effective, because it changes the war from us versus the empire into who among us is already purchased. Once that suspicion spreads, it can collapse a coalition faster than any battle. Men stop sharing information. Lords stop sending troops on time. Captains start holding back their best soldiers, just in case. The alliance becomes a set of separate survival projects. Now look at the bribe from the defector's point of view. Not to excuse it, but to understand why it works. The empire offers certainty, recognized status, stable income, and a future that is not built on constant scarcity. Skanderbeg offers honor, identity, and a life spent under permanent threat. In a world where winter hunger can be as lethal as Ottoman steel, certainty is a seductive god. So a betrayal happens, and it creates an immediate military risk. An Ottoman force led by someone who knows Skanderbeg's playbook. But the deeper risk is symbolic. If a respected commander walks away, it tells everyone else that even insiders doubt the war is winnable. This is where Skanderbeg's response becomes one of the most revealing choices of his leadership, because it forces you to confront what kind of power he is building. He could rule by terror, the way empires often do when they feel insecure, make a public example, kill the traitor, and scare everyone into obedience. That approach is clean and immediate, and it's emotionally satisfying. But it has a hidden cost. It teaches your own coalition that loyalty is maintained by fear, which means loyalty will vanish as soon as fear shifts direction. Or he can attempt something riskier, turn mercy into a political instrument. In several retellings, Moisey returns in submission and Skanderbeg forgives him, restoring him to favor. Again, treat the most theatrical details as narrative garnish. But the strategic logic is worth keeping because it fits the realities of coalition warfare. Forgiveness can be a weapon if it creates a stronger binding force than punishment. If a man who has defected is allowed back in, he becomes indebted, not just politically, but existentially. He returns not as an equal, but as someone whose life is now tied to the leader who spared him. This is a cold truth about power. Mercy is not always kindness. Sometimes mercy is a form of control that creates loyalty through gratitude, shame, and irreversible dependence. And if it works, it sends a message outward. It tells the coalition, this is not Ottoman governance. This is not a system where a mistake means annihilation. It frames Skanderbeg as a leader worth suffering for, not merely a commander you fear. That matters because, in a prolonged war, you do not keep men fighting with fear alone. Fear eventually finds an exit. You keep them fighting with meaning. But mercy is also dangerous. It risks normalizing defection, teaching other commanders that betrayal is survivable, and it risks your own authority. If you forgive too easily, you look weak. If you punish too harshly, you look like the empire you claim to resist. This is why betrayal becomes the central weapon in the middle act of Skanderbeg's war. It forces him to become not only a tactician, but a moral manager, balancing justice and utility, pride and survival, public symbolism and private necessity. Meanwhile, the Ottoman court is watching closely and drawing conclusions. If betrayal can shake the League, it should be pursued with method, not once, but repeatedly. Family members, nephews, rival lords, anyone with ambition becomes a potential purchase. The Empire doesn't need to win every battle if it can make Skanderbeg spend his life policing the inside of his own coalition. And this is the pivot into the next major turning point. When the Ottomans come again with significant force, they will not only march with soldiers, they will march with someone who knows the mountains, the signals, the habits, the psychology of the League. So here is the open loop that drives us into the next phase. If the Empire can't break Krujë, can it break Skanderbeg's most valuable resource, trust, by turning his own commanders and family into tools of imperial strategy? By the mid-1450s, the war has matured into something uglier than a sequence of battles. It becomes a contest over prediction. The Ottomans are not trying to win one decisive afternoon. They are trying to make resistance feel mathematically irrational, so that Albanian lords return to separate deals, and villages stop feeding a war that never ends. Skanderbeg, meanwhile, is trying to do the opposite, to make Ottoman power feel expensive, uncertain, and repeatedly embarrassed. Not forever, just long enough to keep the coalition alive. This is why 1457 matters. It is not simply another victory. It is a strategic performance designed to break the Empire's psychological advantage, the belief that it can read the battlefield better than its opponents. The episode, usually framed as the Battle of Albalina, takes place in the context of Ottoman pressure and internal fracture. By now, the Ottomans understand that sending a force into the mountains only to be bled by raids is inefficient. They want to lure Skanderbeg into a situation where his own pattern becomes a trap. And they have another lever: insiders. Figures like Hamza Castrioti, Skanderbeg's nephew in many accounts, are remembered as turning against him and aligning with the Ottomans. Whether every detail of that betrayal can be proven to modern standards is less important than what it represents: the Empire aiming for the joints, not the bones. So Skanderbeg does something that looks, on the surface, like collapse. He disappears. For weeks, he avoids engagement. The countryside goes quiet. Signals that normally flicker across ridgelines are cold. Villages are emptied. The Ottoman army advances and finds nothing. No pitched battle, no confident ambush, no visible concentration of Albanian forces. This is not cowardice. It is a psychological setup. A large invading army lives on assumptions. It assumes it will be observed, then resisted, then forced into cautious movement. When that resistance doesn't appear, the army begins to reorganize its expectations. It relaxes. It spends more time foraging, more time resting, more time acting like it owns the landscape. Discipline softens because discipline is exhausting, and soldiers will always take comfort when they believe the danger has passed. This is where the trap is built, not from clever geometry, but from human fatigue. The heat of summer matters here in a way that medieval chronicles rarely emphasize, but every soldier understands. In oppressive heat, bodies become heavy. Armor becomes punishment. Men seek shade. Commanders tolerate slackness because forcing constant readiness can create its own breakdown. And if an army believes the enemy has withdrawn, the most dangerous moment becomes the one nobody watches: midday, when vigilance collapses into routine. At Albalina, Skanderbeg uses absence as bait. He keeps his force hidden, quiet, disciplined, and patient, until the Ottoman camp behaves like a camp that thinks the war is already over. Then, he strikes. Accounts describe a sudden assault that catches the Ottomans in disorder before they can form coherent lines. The essence is what matters. An army that cannot assemble into a machine becomes a collection of isolated men. In that moment, numbers stop being advantage. They become crowding. Confusion spreads faster than orders. Cavalry can't deploy properly. Units don't know where their officers are. The center of gravity of the camp, its command coherence, falls apart. This is why medieval surprise attacks can be so devastating. It's not just that people are caught sleeping. It's that the entire system of control collapses. And once it collapses, slaughter is less about skill and more about momentum. Men don't die only because they are struck. They die because they cannot coordinate escape. Now, because popular scripts love big numbers, you will often hear claims of enormous Ottoman casualties at Al-Bilina. Treat those figures cautiously. Medieval tallies are notoriously elastic, and victorious sides have every incentive to inflate them. But you do not need precise arithmetic to understand the strategic result. It is a major defeat, serious enough to echo across the region, serious enough to reinforce Skanderbeg's central message. Ottoman forces are not an unstoppable natural law. The capture of Hamza, if accepted in its broad outline, adds another layer. Skanderbeg's war is not only against Ottoman armies, but against the Ottoman ability to turn family and status into weapons. Hamza is reportedly removed from the Albanian theatre, sent away, imprisoned, or held under foreign custody rather than executed. That choice, like the earlier question of mercy, is not only moral, it is political. Killing a relative can create martyrs and feuds. Removing him can neutralize the immediate threat while avoiding internal blood debts that could fracture the coalition further. And now the psychological outcome is the real prize. Al-Bilina attacks the empire's myth at its root: competence. The Ottoman Empire projects inevitability because it projects organization, because it looks like the adult power in the room. When that adult power is made to look careless, surprised, and panicked, its aura thins. Border lords elsewhere begin to wonder if the empire can be managed, delayed, even tricked. That is dangerous for an empire that relies on fear as administrative glue. But humiliation triggers escalation. This is the part naive narratives miss. A superpower does not respond to embarrassment by giving up. It responds by becoming more systematic. It responds by building permanent structures that reduce unpredictability. It responds by changing the terrain of the conflict itself. And that is exactly where we are heading. Because if raids and surprise battles are making annual campaigns costly, the Ottoman solution is not only send a bigger army, it is to build a base, a choke point, a permanent knife in the center of Albania. Something that turns Skanderbeg's guerrilla advantage into a slow suffocation. So here is the open loop that pushes us into the final act. When a superpower realizes it cannot win quickly, it stops chasing victory and starts building permanence. What happens when Mehmed II brings not just an army, but infrastructure, fortresses, roads, and a strategy designed to outlast the man holding the coalition together? If you want to understand how empires survive, don't look first at their armies. Look at their audiences. Because Skanderbeg didn't just fight the Ottomans, he fought the political addiction of Western Europe, the habit of applauding resistance as long as someone else bleeds for it. By the early 1460s, his war had already done what impossible stories are supposed to do. It had kept the Ottoman advance expensive. It had forced campaigns into years. It had made the empire's myth of inevitability take dents in public. And that is exactly why Western leaders loved him. He proved that the wall could hold, so they didn't have to become the wall. But a wall still needs stone. Skanderbeg needed supplies, money, and a coalition kept coherent through years of scarcity. He needed allies who could do more than send letters that called him a hero. He needed reinforcements, ships, and a plan that didn't evaporate the moment it became inconvenient. The Ottomans were not going to stop because Europe admired courage. Empires don't retreat from admiration. They retreat from cost. So Europe's next move, on paper, looked like the beginning of real commitment, a crusade. Pope Pius II was not naive about the Ottoman threat. He understood that Constantinople had fallen, that Mehmed II was not merely expanding territory, but rewriting the map of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. He also understood what many European princes pretended not to, that if the Balkan frontier collapsed completely, the Adriatic was not a mythic barrier, it was a route. In 1464, Pius II went to Ancona to launch the expedition. The symbolism was deliberate. A pope standing at a port, calling for a coalition, presenting the project as the defense of Christendom. This was supposed to be the moment when words turned into ships. And for a brief moment, it almost worked as theatre. People gathered. There were preparations. There were proclamations. There were the familiar European gestures, commitments that sounded large in letters and became smaller in logistics. Because building an army is not the same as declaring one. Here is the part that matters. Europe did not fail because it lacked faith. It failed because it lacked alignment. Princes were busy with their own rivalries. Treasuries were cautious. Mercenary forces were unreliable. Every ruler wanted the Ottomans contained, but each wanted containment purchased by someone else's budget. This is where the big question becomes cruelly clear in a new form. If the Ottoman Empire rules by inevitability, Europe also rules itself by inevitability. The inevitability of self-interest. The inevitability that grand unity will be promised at the highest moral pitch, and then quietly reduced to what each participant can afford without real risk. The Crusades' collapse was not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic. It was administrative. It was a chain of not yet, not enough, soon, when the situation improves, when the others commit first. And then reality delivered the simplest, most final interruption. Pius II died in Ancona in August 1464. That death did not merely remove a leader, it removed the only thing holding the performance together, the central will forcing the coalition to exist. The expedition unraveled because the coalition was never a system, only a momentary convergence of fear and optics. Without the Pope's personal pressure, the ships did what people do when the bill comes due. They turned away. Imagine what that looks like from Skanderbeg's side of the sea. Albania isn't a stage. It's a country being ground down by repeated campaigns. A coalition of lords held together by the daily management of hunger, distrust, and exhaustion. You cannot feed troops with papal rhetoric. You cannot repair walls with medals. And every year that Europe delays is a year Mehmed II can consolidate elsewhere. Bosnia, the Aegean, the Black Sea routes. Then return to Albania with more experience, more resources, and less patience. Ancona is the moment Skanderbeg learns the truth behind the applause. Europe liked him as a symbol because symbols are cheap. Symbols don't require you to change your priorities. Symbols don't demand that you stop fighting your neighbor long enough to fight the empire. This is not just betrayal. It is complicity through convenience. Because the Western powers were not ignorant of what was happening, they understood the stakes well enough to praise him as their shield. They simply chose the low-cost version of support. Celebrate the shield, send a little money, keep the distance, and hope the frontier holds long enough for them to finish whatever they were doing. And Skanderbeg, watching the crusade die on the beach, is forced back into the most brutal reality of all long wars. You don't get to choose whether you are alone. You only get to choose what you do with loneliness. He returns to his mountains with a thinner coalition and a clearer enemy. Not only Mehmed II, but the arithmetic of abandonment. He is still holding the line, but now he knows the line is also a marketplace, where other powers purchase safety with his suffering. So here is the turn into the endgame. When help fails, empires don't become kinder. They become more permanent. Mehmed II is not going to keep spending summers chasing a man who can vanish into forests and make camps bleed. He is going to change the terrain of the war itself. The open loop now is not whether the Ottomans will invade again. It's this: when a superpower stops trying to win quickly and starts trying to win forever, by building fortresses, locking roads, and turning occupation into infrastructure. Can a coalition built around one man survive the moment the war becomes permanent? After Ancona, the illusion dies. Nobody is coming to save Albania in a grand, unified stroke. And once that becomes clear, the conflict enters its final form, the form empires prefer. Because empires do not like chasing ghosts. They like building cages. Mehmed II had already proved what he could do to walls at Constantinople. But Albania was a different kind of problem. Its fortresses sat in rock. Its fighters dissolved into forests. Its population could evacuate and deny forage. Its resistance was not a single city to be taken, but a pattern to be interrupted. You can smash a wall with cannon. You cannot smash a tactic that refuses to be present. So Mehmed shifts from the language of campaign to the language of control. This is the move that separates a powerful state from a mature empire, when it stops treating conquest as an event and starts treating it as construction. In 1466, the Ottomans build the fortress of Elbasan in central Albania as a permanent base of operations. This is not a poetic gesture. It is a logistical weapon, a forward depot, a place to store supplies, shelter troops, stage raids, and project authority year-round. A fort like this changes the math of resistance because it reduces the empire's main weakness in Albania: long, vulnerable supply lines and the need to withdraw seasonally. If you want to see the philosophical heart of imperial power, look at what a permanent fortress does. It says, "We will not argue with you every summer. We will live here." It turns war into administration. It turns resistance into a chronic condition rather than a dramatic moment. And chronic conditions are what empires specialize in managing. For Skanderbeg, Elbasan is a nightmare because it attacks his advantage directly. His strategy relied on mobility, surprise, and making large armies suffer. But a permanent base means the empire can run smaller, more frequent operations. It can patrol, it can punish, it can hold corridors, and force constant defensive responses. The rebellion is dragged into exhaustion. This is also where the moral calculus becomes brutal for civilians. When Mehmed brings a large army into Albania in 1466, Skanderbeg is forced toward denial tactics, evacuation, destruction of stores, refusal to let the invader feed on the land. The scorched earth logic is simple and cruel. An Ottoman army is huge, and huge armies must eat. If you remove the food, you remove the army's time. You make it sick, you make it slow, you make it leave. But that same denial punishes the people you are trying to protect. Burning your own crops is not a clever tactic when you are the one who will starve in winter. Destroying livestock is not strategy when it is your children's milk. This is the reality behind heroic resistance. It often requires a population to accept suffering now to avoid subjugation later. And not everyone agrees, because not everyone experiences later as a guarantee. This is where empire's psychological strategy becomes sharper. Mehmed does not only try to defeat Skanderbeg, he tries to break the will of the population to keep paying the cost of resistance. In many wars, terror is not simply cruelty, it is communication. It tells communities, your leader cannot save you, your sacrifices are meaningless, submit and the pain stops. Accounts of atrocities in this phase exist in many narratives, but the historian's discipline is to avoid treating the worst stories as automatically precise in every detail. The important truth we can say without inflating: Ottoman campaigns included punitive violence, enslavement, and harsh measures designed to deter defiance. The empire understood that fear, properly deployed, can be cheaper than prolonged fighting. And Skanderbeg understands something equally cold. If the population's belief breaks, the coalition breaks. A fortress like Elbasan is not only a base for troops, it is a base for rumor. It radiates inevitability. So he responds the way he has always responded, by trying to make the empire's permanence expensive. Raids on supply columns, ambushes in passes, night attacks that turn camps into places where nobody rests. But Mehmed is not Murad. He adapts. He fortifies his encampments. He tightens discipline. He refuses to be drawn deep into the terrain where Skanderbeg's mobility becomes lethal. This is the empire learning to defend its logistics against the very tactics that embarrassed it earlier. That is why Elbasan is the turning point. It marks the moment the war becomes less about singular victories and more about endurance under a tightening noose. Even when Skanderbeg succeeds tactically, forcing withdrawals, delaying sieges, the strategic environment worsens. Each season, the Ottoman infrastructure grows. Each season, the coalition's resources shrink. Now return to the big question, because by 1466 it has become unavoidable. What breaks the myth of inevitability? Skanderbeg has already proven the myth can be punctured in battle, but an empire can survive punctures if it can replace myth with machinery, if it can make control tangible in stone, roads, and permanent garrisons. An empire does not need to be believed if it can be present everywhere. So the endgame is no longer simply, can Skanderbeg win? The endgame is, can he keep the coalition alive long enough for the empire to tire, fracture, or be diverted elsewhere without starving his own society into surrender? Because time, the resource he once weaponized against the Ottomans, is now being weaponized against him. And that leads to the final, most dangerous truth. If the resistance is held together by one man's credibility, what happens when the man's body fails, even if his strategy hasn't? The open loop into the last part is this. If Mehmed can't kill the idea of Skanderbeg quickly, can he simply outlast the man? Until death, exhaustion, and hunger do the Empire's work for it, Skanderbeg does not die in a final duel. He dies the way most commanders secretly fear they will die. Not in glory, not by a blade worthy of the story, but by illness, his body failing while the war continues without him. In January 1468, he dies in Lezhë. The date is not just a biographical detail, it is a strategic event. Because the League of Lezhë was never a modern state with institutions that could replace a leader like a cog. It was a coalition held together by reputation, negotiation, and the repeated proof that following this man did not automatically lead to extinction. When that proof is no longer alive to renew itself, the alliance enters its most predictable phase, fragmentation. This is where the historian has to be honest and the storyteller has to be disciplined. We can't pretend the story ends because the hero dies. The real ending is colder. The system moves in and tests what was real. If Skanderbeg had been magic, the war would end instantly with his death. It doesn't. Resistance continues in pockets. Fortresses hold. Veterans fight on. But what changes is coordination. Rivalries that were suppressed by necessity begin to return. External powers, especially Venice, make decisions based on their own trade and security calculations, not on Albanian identity. And the Ottoman Empire, under Mehmed II, does what an empire does best when the opponent loses central cohesion. It turns pressure into routine. This is the answer to a question viewers rarely ask. Why do empires often look unstoppable after the charismatic leader on the frontier dies? Because empires do not depend on charisma. They depend on systems. A system only needs the other side to lose its organizing center. Then it can win by default. One fortress, one treaty, one bribe, 1 year at a time. So the post-1468 phase becomes a methodical closing operation. Krujë, Skanderbeg's iconic fortress, does not fall immediately. That matters. It shows the resistance had real capacity and real people, not just one man. But in 1478, after prolonged pressure, Krujë falls. Whatever the exact details of negotiations and promises in the final surrender, the structural outcome is clear. The symbol that had survived Murad-Thul's major siege in 1450 and resisted through decades of campaigning is now absorbed into Ottoman control. Then comes Shkodër, Scutari, another decisive stronghold, this time tied closely to Venice's strategic network. The fighting in 1478 to 1479 is brutal and politically complicated, because it's not only Albanians resisting, it's Venice calculating how much it is willing to spend to retain a fortress against Mehmed II's artillery and attention. And in 1479, the wider Venetian-Ottoman War ends by treaty. Venice yields key positions, including Shkodër, because empires force choices, spend endlessly on a fortress, or cut losses and protect the rest of your commercial world. This is what Europe's hollow applause looks like in its final form. Not only the failure to send a crusade, but the willingness to sign away the last major bastion when the cost becomes inconvenient. Now the story returns to the image that opened our narrative, the grave. Later tradition claims Ottoman soldiers disturbed Skanderbeg's tomb at Lezhë and took pieces of his remains as talismans. Treat it carefully. The most theatrical details belong to legend. But the impulse behind it, the desire to dismantle a symbol physically, is historically believable as a behavior of power. Empires don't just conquer territories, they try to conquer memory. They rename places, they convert institutions, they rewrite the story so that resistance becomes either a criminal episode or a childish myth. And here is the paradox. In trying to erase a symbol, you sometimes confirm its power. Because Skanderbeg's legacy is not primarily in what he held permanently. Albania did, in the end, fall under Ottoman rule for centuries. His legacy is in what he delayed and what he demonstrated. He proved that Ottoman inevitability was not natural law, it was a strategy. He forced the empire to spend time and resources repeatedly, and time is the one resource you can never recover. That is the philosophical core of the big question we posed in Act 1. When an empire rules by myth, invincibility, inevitability, history is on our side, what breaks that spell? The answer is not one great victory. Skanderbeg had victories, yes, but empires can absorb defeats. The answer is cost. The moment the empire is forced to keep paying real costs in time, logistics, manpower, and credibility for longer than its myth can comfortably explain. Skanderbeg's resistance did not destroy the Ottoman Empire. It did something subtler, and in some ways, more dangerous. It exposed the empire's power as something that could be audited. And once power can be audited, it can be challenged somewhere else, by someone else, in a different decade. But we also have to answer the complicity we exposed along the way. Who benefited? Western Europe benefited, not as a moral triumph, but as a strategic fact. Every season the Ottomans spent bleeding in Albania was a season they were not spending across the Adriatic. The Italian states continued their own politics, their own art, their own rivalries. They enjoyed time. And time was purchased by someone else's villages being emptied, someone else's harvest being burned, someone else's children growing up inside a permanent war economy. That is the harsh lesson at the end of this story. Frontier resistance is often celebrated as heroic, but it is also often exploited as a buffer, admired from a safe distance, funded just enough to keep it alive, but rarely reinforced enough to win decisively. So what survives after the fortresses fall? Memory survives. Diaspora survives. The Arboresh communities in southern Italy preserve language and identity long after Albania is absorbed into Ottoman administration. Within Albania, local traditions keep the name alive even when political structures are crushed. And the modern Albanian flag, the black double-headed eagle on red, echoes the heraldic symbol associated with the Castrioti line, carried forward as a national emblem. That is the final twist. The empire outlasted the man and conquered the land, but it did not fully conquer the story. It could occupy valleys. It could build fortresses like Elbasan. It could convert the war into administration. But it could not make everyone forget that for 25 years, a defecting commander forced a superpower to behave like a nervous animal, returning again and again to crush an idea it could not afford to let spread. So the grave is not really about bones. It's about what empires fear most. Not death, but contagion. The spread of the belief that inevitability is negotiable. And that resolves our big question in the clearest possible terms. An empire's myth collapses when someone forces it to pay visible costs long enough that the audience stops believing the myth and starts believing the receipts.